They said the Lace Museum was just a place for preserving beauty, but some things, once stitched into fabric, never die. They wait, they whisper, and they kill. When Miss Marple is invited to a quiet village fundraiser, she uncovers something ancient, cursed, and still very much alive. Each clue she follows threads closer to madness. Watch closely, because this mystery rewards those who stay till the very end. And trust us, you'll want to be there when the final twist is revealed. If you love unraveling dark mysteries and chilling secrets, subscribe now so you don't miss what others can't see. Like the video if you're brave enough to follow the clues, and share it with someone who thinks they've seen every twist. Because this one, they won't see coming. Chapter 1. The Arrival. In the gentle hush of an English afternoon, where the sun filtered through lace-curtained windows and the air carried the faint scent of lavender and old books, Miss Jane Marple found herself journeying to the quaint village of Little Davington. The train chugged along, its rhythmic cadence a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. She was en route to the historic Lace Museum, invited to a fundraising gala that promised an evening of delicate fabrics and even more delicate conversations. Little Davington, nestled amidst rolling hills and ancient oaks, was a village that time had seemingly forgotten. Its cobblestone streets and ivy-clad cottages whispered tales of generations past. The Lace Museum, a grand Georgian manor turned repository of textile history, stood at the village's heart, its stone facade bearing the weight of centuries. As Miss Marple's carriage approached, the museum loomed into view, its tall windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. The building exuded an air of quiet dignity, its symmetrical architecture and manicured gardens a testament to the meticulous care bestowed upon it. Yet, as with many old structures, there was an undercurrent, a subtle tension that hinted at secrets long buried. Upon arrival, Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Edith Finch, the museum's curator, a woman of stern countenance and precise movements. Mrs. Finch wore her authority like a well-fitted glove. Her attire, a high-necked blouse and ankle-length skirt, spoke of a bygone era, as did her clipped speech. "Miss Marple, I presume. Welcome to the Lace Museum. We are honored by your presence." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her eyes taking in the intricate lace collar adorning the curator's blouse. "A beautiful piece. Is it from the museum's collection?" Mrs. Finch's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Indeed, a personal favorite. Inside, the museum was a labyrinth of rooms, each dedicated to different eras and styles of lacework. Delicate displays showcased the evolution of the craft, from the bold patterns of the Renaissance to the ethereal designs of the Edwardian age. The air was tinged with the scent of aged fabric and polished wood, creating an atmosphere both reverent and intimate. As they moved through the exhibits, Mrs. Finch introduced Dr. Alistair Emery, the museum's resident historian, a tall, gaunt man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. Dr. Emery had an absent-minded air, his thoughts seemingly always a step ahead of the present conversation. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, extending a hand. "A pleasure. The history of lace is a tapestry of human endeavor, don't you think?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, noting the ink stains on his cuffs and the slight tremor in his handshake. Their tour concluded in a dimly lit chamber at the museum's rear. Here, the atmosphere shifted, the air felt heavier, the silence more profound. At the center stood a glass case, within which hung an embroidered lace panel, unlike any other. The panel depicted a woman suspended mid-air, her features obscured by a veil, her limbs limp. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each thread meticulously placed. Yet, the image evoked a sense of unease. "An unusual piece," Miss Marple observed. Dr. Emery nodded, his gaze fixed on the panel. "It's known as the Hanging Woman. Its origins are murky, but it's believed to be the work of a 17th-century artisan." The panel has always been displayed backward, as per tradition. Tradition? Yes, Mrs. Finch interjected. It's said that viewing the panel head-on invites misfortune. Superstition, of course, but we honor it nonetheless. Miss Marple studied the panel, her eyes narrowing. There was something unsettling about it, an almost imperceptible movement, as if the threads themselves were alive. She turned away, the image lingering in her mind. As the evening progressed, guests arrived, their laughter and chatter filling the museum's halls. Among them was Margot, a young assistant with downcast eyes and a nervous demeanor. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence almost ghost-like. Miss Marple approached her. "You must be Margot." "I'm Miss Marple." Margot offered a tentative smile. "It's an honor, ma'am. Are you enjoying the gala?" Margot hesitated. "It's overwhelming. So many people." "Indeed. But sometimes, amidst the crowd, one can observe the most interesting things." Margot's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. As the night wore on, the festivities continued, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the surface, something was amiss. The museum, with its silent halls and shadowed corners, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And as the clock struck midnight, a chill wind swept through the corridors, extinguishing candles and plunging the museum into darkness. In the ensuing silence, a single thread from the embroidered panel unraveled, drifting to the floor like a whisper. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. If you've enjoyed this chapter and wish to unravel the threads of this mystery further, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more tales of intrigue and suspense to life. Chapter 2. A Whisper in Lace. The last of the guests had long departed, their laughter now only a memory that lingered faintly in the air, like the residue of perfume, floral, artificial, and fading. The final clink of teacups had ceased. The chairs had been re-straightened with dutiful hands, and the lace museum, so animated just hours before, now exhaled back into its habitual stillness, as though resentful of the disturbance. Candles flickered gently in wall sconces, casting quiet flames across aged tapestries and the mahogany trim that lined the corridors. It was just past midnight when Margot, dutiful as ever, began her solitary walk through the museum's halls, tasked with checking locks, ensuring all exhibit lights were dimmed and that the storerooms were properly closed. She had not expected to be alone. Mrs. Finch had said she would stay behind, as was tradition after a gala, to secure the archive ledgers, but the curator had vanished shortly after 11, with only a tight-lipped nod, muttering something about a telegram and a restless dog. That had left Margot, whose quiet nature often made her invisible to those around her, to shoulder the night's final responsibilities. Yet invisibility had its price. Tonight, it meant isolation. Her footsteps echoed gently on the oak flooring, each one accompanied by the creak of age-old wood and the delicate sound of her own breath, which seemed too loud, too fragile in the cavernous hush. The glass cases that had earlier gleamed under exhibit lights now loomed like sarcophagi in dimness, their contents only half visible, as if shrinking from her gaze. The lace panels, once admired for their elegance and intricacy, now appeared spectral, netted memories frozen in time, each stitch a whisper of some forgotten tragedy. She moved into the north wing, where the oldest pieces of the museum's collection were kept. It was colder here. The windows, leaded and narrow, let in little light even by day. At night, they offered nothing but black mirrors. As she passed one, her reflection stared back at her, barely distinct in the shadow. Behind her reflection, only for a second, she thought she saw another figure, a woman, tall, slender, draped in black, wearing what appeared to be a lace mourning veil over her face. Margot turned. Nothing, only the faint rustle of fabric, or perhaps her imagination, The cold deepened. The wing led to the central exhibit hall, home to the museum's most controversial piece, the Hanging Woman, a 17th century lace embroidery, whose origin remained shrouded in contradiction and superstition. It was displayed backwards, the plain linen side facing out, a tradition kept not out of curatorial judgment, but community insistence. Rumors persisted. Visitors reported headaches. Staff swore the panel changed slightly between days. Some believed that the figure in the lace wasn't embroidered, it was woven by hand, over years by a woman sentenced to a convent after her husband's disappearance. Others claimed it was a warning, a curse stitched into form. The museum never acknowledged such stories, but they never refuted them either. Margot paused before the panel, her lantern trembling in her hand. There was something magnetic about it. The threads, off-white, tinged with time, seemed to ripple minutely, though the air was still. She leaned closer, ignoring the chill, now settling over her shoulders. Her own reflection merged with the texture of the glass, and for one impossible moment, she thought she saw her own face replaced by another, eyes hollow, lips stitched shut, a veil trailing down like a shroud. She blinked. Her reflection returned. Nothing else. No face but her own, pale and drawn in the flickering glow. The whisper came then, just over her left shoulder, soft, feminine, but not kind. It did not form words, not quite, but there was cadence, as though someone speaking from beneath layers of cloth. It wasn't the creak of the floor. It wasn't wind. There was no draft. It was speaking, or trying to. Margot backed away, her heart thudding in her chest, a chill climbing the back of her neck. She turned to face the hallway, empty. The light of her lantern flickered violently as she stepped back, and in the silence that followed, she heard it again. Not a whisper this time, a sigh, drawn out, mournful, and close. She ran, but not far. She stopped herself just outside the textile conservation room, her hands gripping the railing of the mezzanine that overlooked the central atrium. Below, the shadows gathered like smoke. She forced herself to breathe, to gather her thoughts. Her logical mind told her this was nothing. The museum creaked. Old buildings shifted. Lace was just cloth, delicate and light, susceptible to even the subtlest draft. But no windows were open. The glass cases were sealed. There had been no air to move the veil, no explanation for the voice, and no one else left it inside. Or so she thought. She stood at the edge of the mezzanine, for longer than she realized, the brass railing cold beneath her fingertips, the low murmur of her breathing the only sound to accompany the shadows that waited below. The atrium of the Lace Museum, always so grand during daylight hours, with its chandeliers gleaming above velvet rope exhibits and schoolchildren milling through like curious mice, now resembled something closer to a cathedral left to rot, echoing cavernous, filled with sacred objects no one quite dared to name. Her thoughts fluttered like frightened birds, never quite landing. She wanted to believe she'd imagined it, wanted very badly, but when she turned her head, slowly, reluctantly, to peer once more into the conservation room's glass wall, the reflection that greeted her wasn't entirely her own. At first it was subtle, an imperfection perhaps, something one might mistake for a ripple in the old leaded glass, or a shadow thrown by a sconce. Her face, yes, it was there, but behind her, too far back for anyone to stand, was the same figure from before, the woman in mourning black, veil drawn low, shoulders too narrow, hands clasped too tightly in front of her. Motionless, soundless, still, but reflected, not present. Margot turned again. The room behind her was empty. Only glass and lace, stillness, and yet when she looked back, when she dared, it remained the figure unmoved, staring at her with a facelessness that carried far more threat than a scowl ever could, because it knew something, Or it remembered something. Or it waited, and now the air changed again. A sound. Small. Almost nothing. A pin drop. No. Not metal. Thread. Yes. Thread unwinding. Somewhere in the stillness, she heard the dry hiss of something soft being pulled tight. Something ancient sliding against itself, tautening invisibly like a snare, and then, a snap. She jolted, nearly dropped the lantern, heart in her throat. It had come from the corridor to her right, the east wing. She had not been there yet that evening, a place lined with antique mannequins and incomplete bodices, a strange place where the museum kept the orphaned pieces, those that had no clear provenance, or were in such poor condition that they remained behind glass, not for display, but for containment. As she stood, trying to decide whether duty or dread should win the moment, the veil on the panel, the hanging woman fluttered again, just barely, just enough. But the air was still, and then the whispers returned, this time closer, less abstract, still indecipherable. Yes, but not like before. These came not from within walls or fabric or floor. They came from behind the glass. Margot began to weep, not loud sobs. No, but tears, fast and cold, slipping down her cheeks without permission, her body's answer to something her mind could not yet name. She turned away. She tried to walk. Her feet moved like her own, and yet not quite. Every step forward was met with resistance from somewhere inside herself, a warning, a resistance rooted in instinct more ancient than fear, but the whispers pursued, not louder, never louder, but more distinct, almost forming words now. Something about names, about seeing, and the word again. She reached the archive room, slid the old key into the brass lock, and turned it. The door opened with a sigh, as though the building itself disapproved of her return. The room smelled of cedar, dust and old paper. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and for a brief moment, felt safe. The silence inside was thicker, as though it had been waiting without interruption since the war. Margot lit the desk lamp, and watched the cone of amber light spread across files and folios. There were hundreds of documents here, a sea of fragile parchment and brittle ribbons. She reached for the ledger that kept visitor logs. Why? She could not say. Something compelled her, the need to confirm. She flipped through pages. Her hands trembled. The ink faded in places, but the names were there, listed by date. She turned back to the date of the last full moon gala, 3 months prior. There was a name, halfway down the page. Margot Aline Emery, her name, but she hadn't worked there yet. She was sure of that. Another page. 2 months ago. Same name. A signature next to it. Not hers. Close, but not quite. She flipped forward again. 1 month ago. Margot. Again. Then nothing for 2 weeks. Then a line written in ink so dark it bled through the page. She returns to mend what she left unraveled. A noise behind her. Fabric. Shifting. She turned slowly. No one. The lace shawl draped over the chair. It had not been there when she entered. She backed out of the room, the ledger still clutched in her hands. She returned to the central hall, to the glass panel that still stood silent. The woman in the embroidery, the hanging woman, had changed again. Margot could feel it. She couldn't articulate how. The position, the arms, the tilt of the head. Different. She approached the case, and then she saw it. Beneath the hanging figure's feet, embroidered in thread almost invisible to the naked eye, a new shape had begun to appear. A second figure, half finished. Female. Margot dropped the ledger. It fell with a thud. She turned. She ran, but not before the reflection caught her again. Just for a moment. And this time, the veiled woman smiled. Margot did not sleep that night, nor did she go home, not really. Her feet carried her to the guest quarters above the museum's east wing, a modest bedroom meant for visiting scholars or historians, whose work demanded odd hours and close access. She had a key. Mrs. Finch had given it to her weeks ago, just in case, she'd said, her tone clipped and dismissive. Margot had never once used it, preferring the comfort of her own home, however small, to the idea of sleeping above the cold, whispering halls. But tonight, there was nowhere else. She entered the room quietly, as if not to disturb something that might already be waiting inside. The space was spare: bed, dresser, basin, one oil lamp. She lit it with shaking fingers, locked the door behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed. There were no windows, only a small vent in the ceiling, through which the night pressed in without offering the comfort of a view. The museum felt different now. It always breathed quietly. Old buildings did, but tonight, its breathing was more intentional. It seemed to expand and contract around her in unseen ways. The wood groaned, but never at random. The floorboard shifted with the precise pacing of steps, footsteps that never came closer, but never retreated either. She clutched the visitor's ledger, still held tightly from before, and opened it again under the flickering lamplight. Page after page, her name appeared: Margot Aline Emery, in varying ink, in slanted handwriting, as if someone had been practicing it over years, or decades. But that wasn't what stopped her breath. It was the earliest page. The date, 1925, long before her time, long before the museum was open to the public. There it was, her name, and not just written, signed, with a flourish she'd never learned, but it was hers, somehow. Beneath it, a note: guest apprentice to Madame Villine. The name meant nothing, yet it unsettled her, with the weight of memory just beyond reach, like a dream recalled only in scent or music. She didn't understand what it meant, but her body reacted. A wave of nausea swept over her. Her heart thudded once, violently. She dropped the ledger, the lamp sputtered, and then, from the vent above, came breath, not a draft, breath, and then words, so faint they could have been imagined, so quiet they might have passed as creaks or the crackle of flame, but they came with rhythm, pacing, cadence. You left it open, child. She stared up at the vent, paralyzed. You left the thread uncut. The voice was not angry. It was not kind. It was old, familiar, disappointed. She rose, opened the door, and fled, not out of terror, but instinct. Something compelled her downward, down the stairs, down the corridor, past the empty cases and the extinguished lamps, all the way to the basement archive, a place few entered willingly. The staircase creaked with each step. She did not question why she went there. She simply followed the path, already laid. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar. The last time she'd seen it, it was locked with a heavy iron bolt. Tonight, it hung open like a mouth waiting for a name. She stepped inside. No light, but the darkness welcomed her. She took 2 steps, then 3, and paused. The scent was different here. Less dust, more earth, as if the walls were not stone but soil, damp, waiting to be turned. The voice returned. She taught you to finish what was begun, but you walked away before the last stitch. Margot turned in circles, the voice without a source, as if it was stitched into the walls themselves. You are not new, Margot. A candle flared. It had not been lit by her. It flickered on a single object in the room, a loom, ancient, unused for decades, yet strung with fresh, white thread, and on the loom, begun, but incomplete, was an embroidery, not lace. Names, dozens of names in fine script, stitched into rows. Some names she recognized: Mrs. Finch, Dr. Emery, others she did not, and then her own, half finished, unclosed. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, and saw the name below hers: Miss Marple, still threadbare, still untouched, still waiting. She touched the loom, and from the darkness, a dozen needles fell from above, landing silently on the floor, the candle extinguished. Behind her, a breath that was not hers. She turned. Nothing, only a veil, drifting in midair, no wind. Chapter 3. Margot's Panic. The morning sun cast a pale light over Little Davington, but within the walls of the Lace Museum, the shadows lingered. Margot awoke in the guest quarters, her sleep disturbed by fragmented dreams of veiled figures and whispered names. The events of the previous night clung to her, a tapestry of confusion and dread. Descending the creaking staircase, she found the museum eerily silent. The exhibits stood as they always had, yet something felt amiss. The embroidered panel, the hanging woman, seemed to have shifted subtly, the threads forming patterns she couldn't recall. Her gaze lingered on the figure beneath the hanging woman, a second form, more defined than before, its features disturbingly familiar. Margot's hands trembled as she reached for the visitor's ledger. Flipping through the pages, she found her name inscribed repeatedly, each entry dated years before her tenure. The ink varied, but the handwriting bore uncanny resemblance to her own. A chill ran down her spine as she read a note beneath one entry. She returns to complete the pattern. A sudden noise, a soft rustle, drew her attention. Turning, she glimpsed a shadow disappearing around the corner. Heart pounding, she pursued it through the corridors, each step echoing louder than the last. The chase led her to the conservation room, where the loom stood, now adorned with a nearly complete embroidery. The names stitched into the fabric included hers, alongside others she recognized from the museum's history. As she reached out to touch the loom, a whisper filled the room. "Finish what you began." The voice was hers, yet not hers, a distorted echo from the depths of time. Overwhelmed, Margot fled, the museum's walls seeming to close in around her. The door would not shut properly behind her, no matter how hard she tried, though she leaned her full weight against it. Margot could not make the guest room latch close. The lock had worked last night. The key still turned, but something resisted, as though the house no longer consented to privacy. She abandoned the effort. Her hands were still trembling, fingernails bitten, and fingertips raw. The memory of that loom, those stitched names, was no longer just a vision. It was a fact. She had seen it, touched it, and the worst part of all was the undeniable familiarity. She didn't remember weaving it, but she remembered finishing it, or trying. Breakfast, or the idea of it, had no appeal. Her stomach was taut with nerves, the kind that made one forget hunger entirely. She chose instead to find Mrs. Finch. She needed, no demanded, explanation. The curator would know something. There was always a brittle control about her that hinted at knowledge not easily offered. Margot crossed the hallway into the West Wing, where the curator's office stood behind a heavy door etched with an embossed crest, some bygone insignia of the original Lace Guild. She knocked twice. No reply. She opened the door. The office was empty. Not only empty, but recently vacated. The desk drawer was open. One of the filing cabinets stood wide, its contents hastily removed. A single key lay on the table, glinting under the light of the desk lamp still burning. It was still warm. She stepped inside. On the desk, tucked between a stack of notebooks, was a letter. "To whom it may concern" was written on the envelope. She unfolded it. "If you are reading this, then the veil has begun to remember again. I have done what I can to contain its influence. But it always begins with her. Always. The names. The thread. The woman in black. You mustn't confront it. Not directly. Burn what you can. Especially the unfinished piece. E. Finch." Margot stood frozen. There were too many things she could not understand. but also too many she suddenly could. The whispers, the veil, the way the panel in the central hall kept evolving. This wasn't madness. Not exactly. It was memory. A memory that didn't belong to her, and yet lived in her body as if it always had. She clutched the letter, and moved quickly, now navigating the corridors with a speed born of instinct. She made her way to the central exhibit hall. The panel had changed again. The second figure beneath the hanging woman was now fully embroidered. It was Margot. There was no mistaking it. The eyes, the hair, even the tilt of her head. She had been stitched into the veil, and worse, her image was facing forward. The panel had been turned. Somehow, no one was supposed to see it like this. No visitor, no curator. It was always displayed backward. Always. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the letter, when a voice, calm, male, spoke behind her. "I wouldn't linger here too long." She turned. Dr. Emery. His expression was unreadable. He adjusted his spectacles with the kind of precision that made the gesture feel rehearsed. "How long have you known?" Margot whispered. Dr. Emery regarded her carefully. "That depends on what you mean by known." She stepped toward him. "Did you stitch it?" He laughed softly. Too softly. "Good heavens, no. I can barely sew a button, but I've studied its history. I knew it was an evolving piece. That's why I came here. To see it work. To see what or who would appear next." Margot stared. "You knew this would happen." "I suspected," he said, stepping past her toward the panel. "But the identity of the second figure, well, that's new." "Why me?" she asked. He didn't turn. "It's not you, not in the way you think. It's the version of you that was left behind. The thread remembers, especially what was unfinished." She stepped back, her mind refusing the logic, but her body already accepting it. The feeling that her life had always been half-lived, half-sewn, was not new. It was only now given name: the veil, the woman, the names. And in the corner of the panel, now stitched in barely there grey thread, a third figure had begun to appear. Older, female, stooped slightly. Miss Marple, but not quite yet. It would be the gardener who first noticed something was wrong. He had arrived earlier than usual, in fact, having forgotten to wind his pocket watch the night before. When he approached the museum's rear grounds, he saw the light still burning in the upper east quarters, long past what any reasonable soul would consider appropriate. That in itself was not cause for alarm. Many of the staff had peculiar habits, and the guest room had always been something of a mystery. But what gave him pause, what made him linger at the edge of the manicured lawn, hand gripping the rusted gate, was the unmistakable sound of something falling from above. Not glass, not wood, fabric. A lace veil, caught on the wind, fluttered from the highest window, and landed inches from his boots. He picked it up, delicate, patterned, and unmistakably part of the museum's historic collection. By the time he reached the front entrance, the door was ajar, and Margot was gone. When Mrs. Finch was summoned by telegram, she did not express shock. She arrived swiftly, took charge of the investigation with the cold precision of a woman who had expected as much. Inspector Cray was called from Davington Square. Miss Marple, who had spent the morning reading in the churchyard, was gently invited to observe the proceedings, which she did with characteristic reserve and meticulous silence. In the central exhibit hall, the panel had been turned backward again. Someone had righted it. Yet the damage had been done. The second figure was now unmistakable, and the third, faint spectral, was taking shape. Miss Marple stood before the glass, her gloved hands clasped, observing quietly. She vanished without a sound. Inspector Cray muttered behind her, thumbing through his notepad. Doors were locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, but she left her scarf behind, snagged on the mannequin's hand. Miss Marple nodded, not quite responding. Her eyes never left the panel. "Miss Marple." She turned. "Inspector, do you know what thread was used to make this panel?" He frowned. "I imagine it's lace, isn't it? Belgian or French?" She smiled gently. "Not the lace, the embroidery, the new additions. Do you know if anyone's tested it?" He paused. "Tested it for what?" "Oh," she said, stepping closer to the glass. "For age." He blinked. "You mean carbon dating, or something equally modern?" she said, still smiling. "Because I think, if you tested that thread, you would find something quite odd. You'd find that it was old. Much older than the day it was stitched, as if the thread had waited." Inspector Cray looked baffled. "And what would that mean?" Miss Marple turned away. "It would mean that what we're looking at is not merely a depiction, it is a record." He scribbled something in his book, brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said after a pause, "do you believe the girl's in danger?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes were grave. "Not in the way you mean," he sighed. "Then what should I tell the press?" She considered him. "Tell them nothing yet. Tell them the girl left early, that she was seen boarding the morning bus, that there is no cause for concern. Because if you tell them the truth now, yes, they'll never return to the museum, and I very much need people to keep coming here. At least until I understand what this place really is." She turned her gaze upward, to the high window above the stair. The very window the veil had fallen from. The pane was closed now, but a figure stood behind it, motionless. Not Margot, someone older. A veil covered her face, and in her hands, a threaded needle. Miss Marple did not flinch, but she whispered to herself, just loud enough for no one to hear, "There is one truth left unspoken, and it is waiting for me." Chapter 4. Secrets in Thread. The morning sun cast a pale glow over Little Davington, yet the Lace Museum remained shrouded in an eerie stillness. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle changes, the way the curtains seemed heavier, the air thicker, as if the building itself held its breath. In the curator's office, a discovery awaited. Tucked beneath a false bottom in an antique drawer, Miss Marple found a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. The entries, penned in a delicate hand, belonged to a woman named Eliza Finch. As she read, a tale of obsession unfolded. Eliza's fascination with a particular lace veil, her belief that it held memories of those who had worn it, and her descent into madness as she claimed the veil whispered secrets to her. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on a passage. "The veil remembers. It weaves the past into the present, binding us in patterns we cannot escape." The words resonated, echoing the recent events at the museum. Determined to uncover the truth, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Emery. Their conversation was guarded, each probing the other for information. Dr. Emery spoke of the veil's origins, hinting at a tragic history involving a woman wrongfully accused and executed. He suggested that the veil was a memorial, a testament to injustice. As Miss Marple left, she couldn't shake the feeling that the veil was more than a relic. It was a witness, perhaps even a participant, in a cycle of events repeating through time. The diary sat on the parlor table, like a sleeping animal, something bound in skin and silence. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, a half-mile from the museum's gates, where the teapot whistled and the clock ticked in rhythm with her thoughts. The windows were open to the breeze, yet the pages of Eliza Finch's diary did not stir, as if they too listened. She turned another page. "The veil sings in the night. I tried to bury it in salt. It returned. The threads knot themselves in my dreams. Mother warned me, do not stitch names unless you wish them forgotten. I have forgotten many." Eliza's words were not the ravings of a madwoman, not exactly. They were too careful, too composed. Miss Marple had seen madness. This was something else: controlled ritual, a quiet desperation. And layered within the prose were patterns, names crossed out, initials replaced, sketches in the margins of lace forms resembling more than simple decoration, spirals, loops, cages. Miss Marple made tea, her hands moving with mechanical grace as she pondered. What did it mean, this idea that a veil could return? And how had Margot's name been inscribed, years before her arrival? More pressingly, what of the half-seen figure now forming in the lace? The figure that bore resemblance not to Margot, but to her. She returned to the museum before lunch, where she found Dr. Emery seated in the archive room, hunched over a bundle of thread samples. He did not look up when she entered, but she could feel his awareness shift. "I suppose you've been reading," he said, as though they were picking up a conversation mid-sentence. "I have," she replied, setting her bag on the table. "Did you know Eliza Finch?" He turned slightly, revealing a faint smile. "Not personally. She was dead by the time I arrived, but her shadow lingered. Even then, people say she lived too long in the museum, that she became part of it. And the veil, her obsession." He gestured to a file beside him, yellowed and brittle. "She claimed it was stitched by a woman named Clothil Velin, a lacemaker from the early 18th century, condemned to silence for reasons unknown. Her final piece was never recovered." Miss Marple opened the file. A single portrait remained, sepia-toned and cracked, showing a gaunt woman seated beside a half-complete lace panel. Her eyes, though blurred by time, seemed to peer outward. There was something in the posture, defiance or mourning. "The museum acquired the veil anonymously," Emery continued. "No origin, no note. It simply arrived, folded in oilcloth, delivered with the 1924 acquisition." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "And you believe it came from Clothil?" He paused. "I believe it came from someone who knew her." Silence stretched. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Dr. Emery, have you ever seen it change?" He hesitated. "Yes," he said quietly. "Twice. The first time shortly after I joined the staff. A name appeared, a local woman. She died that same week, fell into the canal. The second time, it was mine." Miss Marple's brow arched. "And yet, here you are." He looked away. "I began unraveling it. I snipped the threads of my name before it was complete. That was enough, I think. But the pattern, it's still there." She nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it's not the veil itself that chooses. Perhaps it is memory, or guilt." He met her gaze. "Perhaps it is time." Miss Marple stood. "In either case," she said, "I must see it again." The door to the weaving room had been locked for decades, or so the staff claimed. Most avoided it, and those who had keys seemed perpetually to misplace them. Miss Marple, however, possessed something rarer than keys: persistence. And within half an hour of her conversation with Dr. Emery, she had not only found the key tucked behind a row of outdated receipts in the museum's ledger vault, but had also obtained permission, granted with suspicious swiftness, to enter alone. The door resisted at first, as if rusted from within, but eventually it gave, sighing open into a room darker and colder than any she had yet explored. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and iron, old thread and salt, time and memory. A single high window cast a shaft of light across the floorboards, illuminating specks of dust that floated like ash in still water. The room was square, symmetrical, deliberately so. In the center, under a linen sheet, sat a loom. She did not touch it yet. First, she walked the perimeter, tracing the edges of the forgotten space. The walls were lined with shelving, filled with skeins of thread, bolts of cloth, small locked boxes. There were notebooks too, different from the public archive volumes. These were private, personal. She opened one at random. "Thread remembers what hands forget. You cannot lie to fabric. Stitch a truth, and it lives. Stitch a lie, and it waits." She closed the book. Approaching the loom now, she slowly drew back the sheet. What lay beneath was not one single tapestry, but layers, veils finished and unfinished, each one laid atop the other like sediment. She lifted the topmost layer. Names. Again, so many names. Names she recognized now. Donors, patrons, volunteers, all had been added. Most had left, some never had. But the final veil, the one beneath them all, was incomplete. A section in the center was empty, bordered by thread drawn taut into small knots. The pattern waited, still forming. And there, woven at the very top, above any name, Clothil Verlin. The room shifted around her, not physically. There was no quake, no movement, but something turned, as if the house, the museum, the veil, had acknowledged her presence. The light dimmed. She took a step back, and heard something fall from a shelf, a spool of thread. It rolled to her feet, and stopped. Miss Marple, bent, picked it up. The thread was not white, nor grey. It was red, not crimson, not garish. Deep, ancient, like dried blood. She looked to the veil again, and saw faintly, beneath the layer of names, beneath even Clothil's, a sigil, stitched in a language older than Latin. It spiraled, but not in chaos. It was a lock, a key, a map. She whispered to herself, "This is not cloth. It is a calendar, a contract." Behind her, the door creaked softly, not opening, breathing. Miss Marple left the room, closed the door behind her, and did not lock it. Whatever was in there had been waiting too long to be kept closed again. She returned to the main hall, and now, the veil in the display case had changed. There were 3 full figures, and a 4th had begun. Its outline faint, younger, male, Emery, but the features were not yet fixed, the thread still moving. Chapter 5. A Stitch of Death. The rain came not in torrents, but in long, thin streaks that whispered against the museum's tall windows, streaking down the glass like finger trails, slow, inevitable, almost intentional. It was the kind of rain that muffled the world, dulled the colors, and made everything feel one step removed from reality. Miss Marple stood by the entrance to the Lace Museum, her gloved hands clasped behind her back, watching the clouds settle in over Little Davington like a shroud. The veil had changed again. She had not yet seen it, not with her own eyes this morning, but the change had been reported by the only staff member still speaking in full sentences. Young Henry, the porter's apprentice, a boy of no more than 16, who'd been too frightened to describe exactly what he saw. Only that it looked more finished. Mrs. Finch had not returned. Margot had still not been found. Dr. Emery, she suspected, knew more than he let on. And yet, she hesitated to confront him. For now, she needed clarity. The veil was her only reliable witness. The gallery hall was cold, not from the weather. No, this cold came from the floorboards themselves, from the stones beneath the foundation. It pressed through the soles of her shoes like a presence rising to meet her. And in the center of the room stood the panel, glass-covered, slightly fogged. The embroidered veil inside no longer shimmered subtly. It glistened. There were now 4 figures, fully rendered. She examined each. First, the hanging woman, unchanged. Second, Margot, head bowed, arms at her sides. Third, Miss Marple herself, unmistakable in posture and detail. And fourth, the newest figure, was clearly Dr. Emery. But the stitching was different, not completed like the others, but agitated, cross-hatched and dense, like thread forced into place, as if the fabric had resisted. His face was contorted, not peaceful, not at rest, not even neutral. It was afraid, and next to his name, in thread so dark it could have been black, was a mark, not a letter, a slash. She turned, and there he was. Dr. Emery stood in the gallery entrance, his face pale, his hands trembling, his eyes unfocused. For a moment, he looked past her, to the veil, and then he looked down at his own hands, as though noticing them for the first time. "I've seen it," he whispered. Miss Marple approached slowly. "What did you see, Dr. Emery?" He swallowed hard. I went into the weaving room last night. I shouldn't have. I tried to cut it again. The panel. He nodded. I thought, if I could just remove my name again. If I could unmake it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And did it let you? His eyes filled with something close to grief. No, the thread wouldn't move. It's not just thread anymore. It's memory. It knows. He collapsed to the floor. She rushed to him. But he was already gone. Not dead. Not unconscious. Simply absent. His eyes were open, but distant, like someone looking backward in time. She called his name. He did not reply. Miss Marple had seen men unravel before. Soldiers, clergymen, bankers. She had watched strong minds bend quietly beneath the weight of war, of scandal, of grief. But Dr. Emery was not unraveling. He had already been unspooled, neatly, methodically, and from the inside. It was as though something had removed the scaffolding of his memory, and all that remained was the shape of the man, without the substance. He did not speak. He did not blink. When she touched his hand, he flinched only slightly, then stilled, like lace left too long in sunlight, fragile, faded, still appearing whole to the eye, but ready to tear at the lightest pull. He was not safe here, and neither was she. She called for Henry, who helped her move Dr. Emery to the guest quarters upstairs. The boy asked no questions. He had begun, it seemed, to operate on instinct alone, as if language now interfered with something more primal. Miss Marple instructed him to remain by Emery's side, and under no circumstances to go near the main gallery. Henry nodded. She returned alone to the north corridor, turning right where the public no longer walked, past cracked tiles and extinguished lanterns, toward a narrow door with no label. Behind it, a staircase descending into the spool room, a space she had only heard mentioned once, in passing, by Eliza Finch's diary. She unlocked the door with the brass key found in the ledger. The descent was slower than she'd expected. The stone steps were worn, uneven. The walls were dry despite the damp air, and along one side of the stairwell, deep vertical scratches marked the plaster, like thread pulled too tight against canvas. At the base, a heavy wooden door, ancient, pocked with nail heads, its hinges fat with rust. She opened it. The smell met her first. It was not mold, not rot. It was aged metal, scorched fabric, and something very faintly floral, like perfume sealed in old envelopes. The room beyond was octagonal. Every wall was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves containing spools, hundreds of them, silk, cotton, linen, silver-threaded, red-dyed, black with age. Each was carefully labeled. Some had names, some had symbols, some had dates, many of which stretched far beyond what the museum had ever documented. Miss Marple moved carefully, noting the order, or lack thereof. She passed one labeled M. Finch, 1961, 1992, another Clara Beresford, 1911, and near the far end of the room, under a glass cloche, Margot Elaine Emery. The thread was not sealed. It was active, unspooling itself, almost imperceptibly, one rotation at a time. Miss Marple bent closer. The thread trailed downward, across the floor, into a groove worn into the stone, one clearly carved by years of motion. She followed it, watching it snake like a living wire, until it reached the center of the room, where a smaller loom stood, not for tapestry, but for binding. This was where names became patterns. She found a notebook beside the apparatus. The paper was fragile. Only one phrase remained legible. She who binds the thread may unbind the memory, but only if the pattern remains whole. She knew then why the veil rejected Emery's attempt to cut his name. It wasn't about protection. It was about preservation. He had violated a rule, not yet spoken aloud, and it had remembered. She stood. Something rustled behind her. A shelf. A breath. She turned. Nothing. But one of the spools, labeled E. Finch, had toppled from its place and landed at her feet. Miss Marple did not move at first. She watched as the spool labeled E. Finch unwound itself on the floor, slowly, almost lazily, as if it were not hurrying to escape, but simply stretching, as if the thread had grown tired of containment and preferred now to breathe. The red thread, her thread, remained still by comparison, but its stillness was not comforting. It was patient. The room had grown colder, and she had not noticed it until then. It was not the chill of a draughty cellar, nor the damp of stone. It was an absence, as if something had vacated the air of its warmth. The light of her lantern pulsed slightly, but did not dim. Then, footsteps above her, quick, muffled, coming down the corridor toward the stairs. She turned toward the door just as it opened. Henry. The boy's face was pale, lips parted, chest rising and falling, as though he had run the length of the building. "Miss Marple," he said, voice shaking. "It's Dr. Emery. He's speaking." She left the room instantly, climbing the stone steps without pause, though each one pressed harder against her knees than the last. At the top, the corridor was darker than before. The sconces had burned lower. The guest room door was open. Inside, Dr. Emery sat upright in the chair. He was whispering, not to anyone in the room, to the air. Miss Marple approached slowly. "Alistair," she said, deliberately using his first name. "It's Jane. Are you all right?" He did not look at her. He stared at the corner of the room, empty space, as though it were lit by something she could not see. "She remembers," he whispered. "She remembers what I did." Miss Marple crouched beside him. "Who, Alistair?" He blinked once slowly. "The one who stitched the veil." Clothild. I thought, if I could erase the name, I could sever the memory. But it doesn't work that way. Not with her. You don't remove yourself. You finish yourself. You thread your own ending." Miss Marple reached for his wrist. His pulse was fast, but steady. "And what does she want now?" He turned to her at last. His eyes were darker than before, rimmed with something more than fatigue. "She wants the name that's missing." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Margot." He nodded. "Barely. The panel is incomplete, and if she's not found, it will take the next." The air shifted. For a moment, the shadows moved as though something passed between them. Silent, unseen. Miss Marple rose. "Stay with him," she told Henry. "No matter what." She returned to the gallery. This time she did not hesitate. She approached the panel, lantern raised. The glass seemed thinner now. The veil beneath was restless, a shimmering film of thread and memory that no longer sat still. And beneath Margot's name, still half-stitched, was a blank. A thread trailed outward, stitched in place but unattached, as if it waited only for a hand to guide it. And there, beside it, a new mark, a needle, embedded in the cloth, pointed outward, as if inviting, as if daring. She turned to leave, and the veil moved, only slightly, but it moved. It was not done. Chapter 6. The hidden chamber. It had rained again overnight, the sort of thin, needling rain that seeped into wood and stone alike. By morning, the museum's corridors were filled not with light, but mist, streaming in through vents and cracks like breath from a sleeping creature. Miss Marple had not slept. She had spent the long hours reading through every diary, every curator's note, every staff record she could locate in the dim, flickering corners of the archive room. And she had found something, just a line, but enough to point her in a direction. Old Finch sealed the west corridor on the day the mirror cracked, said it wasn't for viewing anymore. West corridor. There was no such thing. Not on the museum map, not on the ground floor, nor the upper. But in the founder's wing, past the tapestry exhibit, there was a gallery wall that made no architectural sense, flat, windowless, with an unlit sconce and no visible entrance. It was too wide for a simple divider, and too long to serve no purpose. Miss Marple walked its length now, cane tapping gently on the marble floor, until she reached the third portrait from the far end, a faded oil of a woman named Beatrice Verline, a lace mistress from 1894. The frame was slightly crooked, not by accident. She reached behind it. There, embedded in the plaster, was an old latch. She pulled, the wall shuddered, and then opened, inward, with a groan that echoed like thunder through a chamber that had not been disturbed in decades. Behind it, dust, silence and stairs. She did not hesitate. The stairs led downward, not into a basement, but into a walled-off wing, an old curator's suite, long abandoned. The walls were lined with portraits, none labelled. Women, mostly, gaunt, veiled, pale, hands clasped in silence, and every single portrait had the same detail, repeated again and again. Their eyes had been embroidered shut. The needlework was fine, precise. Someone had gone to great lengths, not to destroy the paintings, but to bind them, thread over oil, cloth through canvas. At the end of the corridor, a heavy curtain covered a doorway. She pulled it aside. The room beyond was circular. In its center, a table covered with lace remnants, thread spools, and something else. A mirror, shattered and buried beneath a linen sheet. The cracks ran outward like the spokes of a wheel, and in its fragments she saw not her own face, but many: Margot, Emery, Finch, hers, and one other, a woman in black. The veil was clearer here. This room was its memory. She stepped forward, careful not to disturb the pattern of thread laid across the floor, a circle, a binding ring. The needle from the veil was not the only one. There were dozens, scattered like bones, all rusted with age, but arranged precisely around the center of the room, as if someone had used them to trap something. But the pattern was broken. A needle was missing. And now, the veil was moving again. Returning to the central exhibit, Miss Marple did not yet speak of the hidden chamber. She said nothing to Henry, nor to the constable now posted by Emery's door. Some truths, she knew, required preparation, and some required witnesses. She stepped once more before the glass, and now, the fifth figure had begun. It was not complete, it was not clear, but it was male. Slight, young. Not Emery, Henry. Miss Marple pressed her palm to the glass. The panel was warm, alive, no longer an artifact. Now, a memory engine. A tool for binding. She turned to the young porter, standing near the gallery door. "Henry," she said gently, "have you ever handled a needle?" He nodded. "My mother taught me how to sew." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes were not kind. "Because we're going to unpick a name. Before it finishes itself. If you've stayed with us this far, you're among the few who can now see the pattern. Stories like this one aren't just watched, they're unwoven thread by thread. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's about to be revealed. Because the next chapter may unravel everything you thought you understood." Chapter 7. The Widow's Curse. The storm returned the next evening, this time with lightning that fractured the sky in long, angry lines. The museum shuddered under the sound of it, as though the wind rattling against its walls were not wind at all, but voices, remembered, unburied, and too long silenced. Miss Marple had returned to the hidden chamber beneath the founder's wing alone. The needle ring was still intact, though one of the needles, she could now see clearly, had been moved. Its position shifted slightly from the circle. Deliberate, recent, and there, just beyond the broken mirror, tucked behind a velvet-lined book chest, was a bundle, a garment, a mourning shawl, and beneath it, a sealed scroll, tied with black thread. The parchment was brittle, but not ruined. She unrolled it carefully, and the ink, though faded, remained legible, written in a hand so elegant, it felt more like lace itself than script. To those who come in judgment, know this was not grief, but justice. He took my name from me. I took his pattern. The bobbin has two ends. Let one speak truth, and the other remember. They made me kneel. I stitched from the gallows. I will not unweave it. Clothilde Velin. Miss Marple lowered the parchment slowly. Clothilde had not died screaming. She had died stitching, with her hands, even bound. She had recorded what had been denied her voice. That was the truth of the veil. Not just a curse, not even revenge. A record, a ledger of betrayals, written in thread. One that refused to forget, and now it had begun again. Because one of the betrayals had been repeated. It was past midnight when Miss Marple returned to the upper floor, her boots damp with cellar water and thread dust. She moved with quiet purpose through the dim hallways of the Lace Museum, past portraits whose painted eyes no longer seemed quite still, past curtains that swayed without a breeze. The museum was no longer resting, it was listening, and someone, she now realized, had been trying very hard not to be heard. She found Dr. Emery in the reading room, seated in the corner chair near the unlit fireplace. He was not asleep, nor awake. His eyes were half-lidded, staring into the hearth, as though waiting for it to speak. "Alistair," she said quietly. "I know who she was now." His eyes moved, barely, but they moved. "She was accused of murder," Miss Marple continued, "and condemned. But it wasn't a crime of rage, it was punishment. Her husband was a merchant. He tried to have her declared mad after taking her family's lace business. When she confronted him, she vanished. Later, he was found hanging from a beam, bound with lace, stitched into silence. Emery didn't answer. Miss Marple sat across from him. She wasn't just a widow, she was a Velin. One of the first to stitch patterns with hidden signatures, messages woven into hems and cuffs. She didn't curse her fabric, Alistair. She preserved the truth in it, and I believe someone in your family knew that. A pause, then, his voice. Dry, low. My grandmother was born Velin. She changed the name when she came to Davington. She married into the Emery line to escape it, but the thread finds its way. Miss Marple folded her hands. You knew the veil was hers. He nodded. You knew what it did. A long breath. I didn't want to believe it. But you did, she said gently, because your name appeared. And instead of unearthing the truth, you tried to erase it. His hands tightened on the arms of the chair. I was trying to protect the museum. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but firm. No, you were trying to protect the story you told about the museum. And now, another name is on the veil. Henry's. Because the pattern always takes what is left unfinished. She rose. There's still time, she said, walking to the door. But the veil doesn't forgive. It only remembers. As she left the room, Emery finally looked at her fully. His eyes no longer seemed afraid. They seemed resolved, but not safe. Never safe. The candlelight in the central exhibit hall was thin, pale, wavering like breath against a mirror. Miss Marple stood once again before the veil, that ancient panel of embroidered judgment, and it no longer resembled an artifact of textile artistry. It was no longer beautiful. It was no longer still. It had become conscious. Not alive, perhaps, but awake. The 5 figures were now fully visible. The 5th, Henry, had taken shape sometime during the last hour, not stitched hastily, as Emery's had been, but lovingly, precisely. His likeness was perfect, down to the angle of his chin, and the one frayed cuff he wore each day without noticing. He was remembered now, and if memory meant permanence, then Henry was almost lost. Miss Marple turned, scanning the hall for him. He was not there. She moved swiftly, more swiftly than her years should have allowed, through the corridor, and into the conservator's anteroom, where a single lamp had been left burning on the table. The room was empty, no sign of struggle, no noise, no note, only thread, spooling slowly from a drop spindle on the floor, deep red, thin as breath, and blood, not much, just a smear on the handle of the nearby drawer, as though a hand had tried to grip it, and failed. She followed the thread. It led out into the hall, up the main staircase, and stopped at the entrance to the weaving room. The door was open. Inside, Miss Marple saw Henry, standing before the loom. He was not frightened. He was not alone. Emery stood behind him, his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't," she said, not loud, soft, firm. Henry turned. His eyes were glassy, his lips were moving, reciting something. A name, over and over, his own, and then, Emery pressed something into the boy's hand. A threaded needle. Miss Marple crossed the room in seconds, faster than reason, faster than disbelief, and knocked it from his grip. Henry gasped, as though woken from underwater. Emery said nothing. He looked at her, calmly. "I thought if we completed it willingly," he said, "the pattern would stop." Miss Marple's voice broke for the first time. "It doesn't want completion, it wants continuity. You don't finish a curse, you feed it." And behind her, on the loom, a sixth figure had begun. Not Henry, not Emery, hers. Chapter 8. Madness in Silk. It began with a bell at the Davington post office ringing by itself, once, twice, 3 times in the middle of the night. The clerk, a man too old for such games, opened the door, only to find the desk drawer containing the unsent telegrams had been emptied, unravelled. The papers torn into delicate strands, wound around the legs of the desk like thread. There was no wind that night, and the door had not been forced. The next morning, Miss Marple took her tea with shaking hands. She no longer tried to deny the coldness that clung to her skin, even when seated by the fire. It was not the cold of weather. It was the cold of unspoken memory, the kind that settles in slowly from within. Her reflection in the teacup shimmered slightly. She blinked, it returned to normal. But for a moment, she had seen something stitched just below her left eye. Not a scar, a single looped thread. She said nothing. She rose instead, dressing carefully, and walked to the museum through narrow lanes where the wind no longer whistled, but whispered. Along the hedge near the bakery, a young boy pointed to the sky and said, "The lady's in the clouds." When asked what he meant, he replied, "She's sewing birds shut so they don't fly away." At the museum gate, the stone plaque had shifted. The carved date, 1791, now read 1713. She knew then that the veil was no longer contained. It was weaving through the village. It had left the gallery and slipped its boundaries. But it had not done so to disappear. It was remembering where it came from. It was preparing something. And if it was already altering her reflection, then it had begun to stitch her memory. Miss Marple no longer trusted the light. Not entirely. She moved now as one might through a half-remembered dream, aware, discerning, but touched by something just slightly wrong. The sun through the windows of the lace museum had turned pale, like milk left too long in porcelain. The hallways no longer obeyed geometry. Doors she passed 3 times in the morning no longer appeared in the afternoon. And yet, no one else noticed. Not Henry, who walked the corridors humming to himself a lullaby. No child should know. Not Inspector Cray, who muttered quietly in the garden while pulling lace thistles from the hedge, plants that should not, and never had existed. And not Emery, who sat silently in the guest room now, never asking questions, only stitching, his hands working as though possessed by a knowledge he did not own. Miss Marple returned to the archives alone. She did not search the shelves. They were wrong now. the bindings blank, the ink faded by design. She knew where the answers lived. Not in books, in photos, in the curator's file box. It was hidden at the back of the lowest drawer, beneath old visitor records and fire safety plans. No one had looked at in 20 years. She pulled it free. The brass clasp had rusted. She cracked it open. Inside, photographs. Dozens, sepia-toned. Staff portraits. She sorted them quickly at first, then slowly, then stopped. Her hands stilled. One image had no date, no name, only a number on the back. 0143M. She turned it over. Her face, unmistakably. But the clothing was Victorian, the hairstyle older, and the photo was cracked, yellowed at the corners. She had never sat for it. And yet, there it was, the same brow, the same chin, the faint scar on the ear she had received falling from her uncle's gate at age 6. It was her. But she hadn't been born when this photo was taken, and at the bottom of the frame, nearly erased, stitched into the border itself, archivist, interim. Miss Marple sat very still. She knew what the veil was showing her now. It wasn't possession. It wasn't memory. It was restoration. The veil did not create. It restored what history tried to forget. She had been here before. She had served this museum, and she had failed. Once, long ago. She returned to the weaving room at dusk, not out of urgency, nor fear. Both had long since passed into something else, but because the veil was waiting. She could feel it, the same way one feels a thunderstorm in the bones before the clouds break. The air buzzed lightly, not with static, but presence, like thread held too long between two hands. Inside the room, the loom sat still. No one else was there. But the thread on the loom was moving, unrolling, winding, stitching, not by hand, but on its own, by the memory held within it. It was her name being added now, her form, her outline. The sixth figure in the veil, no longer faint, no longer suggestion, fully rendered, but unfinished. And then the sound came, not a voice in the room, not a person speaking aloud, but the gentle rasp of thread being drawn through fabric, again and again, forming syllables the way a needle forms meaning in linen. The voice of the veil, not loud, not angry, female, calm, precise. You left the pattern open. You named others, but never yourself. You remember truth. That is your sin. Miss Marple stood very still, her hand near the curtain. You may leave, it said, but the pattern will remain unfinished. She closed her eyes. Or you may stay, and finish what was begun. Her mouth opened, but no words came, because somewhere inside her, beneath the years, the books, the tea leaves and gentle village talk, she knew. She had been the archivist. She had held the ledger once before, and in a moment of weakness, fear perhaps, or pride, she had hidden a name, Clothold's name. She had betrayed her, and now, the veil was offering her the same place it had given to all the others who had run from their threads. Miss Marple opened her eyes. She did not step forward, but she did not leave. She whispered, one word, no. The veil paused. For the first time, it hesitated, and in that moment, a single thread on the loom snapped. Chapter 9. Lace never forgets. The rain had stopped by morning, but it left behind a sky bleached of colour. Birds were absent from their usual wires. The church bell failed to ring, and the sound of wheels on cobblestone felt too loud, too sharp, as if the village had become a stage set, abandoned mid-performance. Miss Marple did not take tea that day. She stood in the museum's central hall, in the silent company of glass and thread, her eyes fixed not on the veil, but on its shadow. There, cast by morning light onto the marble floor, the veil's image twisted, 5 figures, one empty space. Her name not yet stitched, but the outline was ready. Behind her, Henry stood quietly, holding the spindle she had removed from his hand 2 nights before. He did not speak. He did not hum. He simply stood there, waiting, as if the veil had passed its attention on to her, and was satisfied, for now. Miss Marple turned, and walked with him back into the founder's wing, to the locked archive of curators past. She had something to show him. Inside the hidden chamber, she lit 2 candles, the mirror, still cracked, the thread circle, still broken, and in the far corner, folded beneath old muslin, was the ledger. She had hidden it again, the night she remembered who she once was. Now she opened it. Page by page, she traced the history of the veil. Not written in paragraphs, but patterns, not explained in prose, but symbols, names repeated, threads coded, a language of texture and order, not sound. And on the final page, her own entry. J. Marple, Archivist, Interim. Authorized displacement, Clothilde Verline. Rationale, unknown. Likely emotional. Final note, name removed, pattern preserved. She had done it, long ago, or perhaps not long at all. She had removed Clothilde's name from the veil. The veil was not revenge. It was a record of truth. Each name on it had committed one sin to lie about what they knew. Finch, Emery, even Margot, all had covered something. And now, the pattern was almost complete, because the veil had never been punishing randomly. It was asking one simple thing: who will finish the truth? There are names one speaks only once in a lifetime, and even then, only when no one else is listening. Some are whispered in the dark, to comfort a child. Others are written in ledgers, and carved into gravestones. But a few are stitched, not for memory, but for restoration, threaded through silence, so they may one day return. Miss Marple stood once more before the panel in the central hall. This time, she brought nothing with her. No cane, no gloves, no ledger, only her voice. Henry stood at the far end of the room. He understood, he didn't need to be told. The veil shimmered faintly. 6 figures now, the 6th still unfinished. Her thread was still waiting. She took a breath, and she said the name, Clothilde Verline. The veil did not move, but the glass fogged over, just slightly, and on the loom, unseen until now, a shimmer of thread twitched, then slid through the linen with the slow grace of something ancient waking. Behind her, a sound, not loud, but final. The mirror from the weaving room, stored months earlier in the back of the East Conservatory, shattered. No one touched it. No one was near it. But it knew. The veil did not seek revenge. It had sought recognition, and now, for the first time in over a century, its maker's name had been spoken aloud. The pattern stilled, and the 6th figure stopped stitching. It was still incomplete, but no longer moving. Miss Marple leaned closer. Beneath her image, in thread too pale to notice from afar, 3 words had appeared. Not in Latin, not in English, French. L.C. Souvient. She remembers. She stood there for a long time, long enough that the light changed, twice. The noon sun had come and gone, casting its white brilliance through the tall museum windows, and pulling soft shadows across the tile, which now resembled lacework itself, fractured, patterned, geometric. The veil had not moved again, nor had the thread, but Miss Marple could feel something stirring, not in the fabric, not in the room, but in herself. Something had been returned. Not knowledge, not memory, but place. For the veil had never truly wanted her name stitched into it. It wanted her acknowledgement. It wanted her to finish what had been undone. And now that she had spoken Clothilde Verline's name aloud, now that the archivist's betrayal had been unmasked, It was offering her a choice: complete the thread, or leave the space unfinished forever. The bargain was quiet. No lightning, no shrieking wind, only this: if she chose to remain, the pattern would settle, the memories would still. Henry would not be taken, nor would any other, but she would belong to the veil, not as victim, but as witness. The needle would not harm her, but it would never let her leave the frame. Her body might remain hers. Her story would not. She walked to the veil again, and pressed one finger to the glass. A fine line of warmth met her skin. Not hot, not cold. It pulsed once, like a heartbeat. She whispered, "And if I refuse?" The veil did not answer. It had already told her everything it needed to. Through silence, through thread, through memory. She stepped back. Then she walked away, not quickly, not defiantly, but with the grace of someone who understood what she was refusing. Behind her, the veil held its breath, and for the first time since Clothild's death, it did not complete the final stitch, because it was still waiting for her. Chapter 10. The pattern repeats. 3 days passed. No new names appeared on the veil. No figures moved. No whispers sounded in the corridors of the museum, nor in the walls. Henry's name, once trembling at the edge of completion, had faded. Slightly. Not gone. Not erased. But blurred, like a memory left too long in sunlight. Miss Marple kept to the archives, though she no longer opened the ledgers. They had become dull things, ordinary again. Paper and ink, no longer pulsing with breath or meaning. The veil had quieted, but it had not disappeared. Dr. Emery remained in a state between silence and lucidity. He responded when spoken to, but remembered nothing of the loom, nothing of the fifth figure, nothing of the moment. The veil rejected him, as though his thread had been tied off at both ends, his part in the pattern complete, but no longer connected to the whole. Even the townspeople, who had murmured of odd happenings and half-glimpsed shadows, began to forget. The museum was reopened to the public on a Tuesday. The staff returned. Margot, however, did not. No one said her name. Not once. It was as if she had never been there at all. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought, she hadn't, at least not this version of her. Perhaps the girl had been claimed not by the veil, but by the pattern that lived beneath it, the one that returned names to the cloth when the world refused to remember them aloud. The new visitor arrived without announcement. He was young, no older than 30, with the polished manner of a university man, trim suit, walking stick, the faint trace of aftershave, more expensive than the shoes he wore. His name, according to the guest book, was Edmund Darrell, a postgraduate in textile anthropology from King's College, researching the semiotic intersections of lace and loss. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow at the phrasing, though said nothing. He toured the museum slowly. Unlike most visitors, he did not linger in the grand exhibit halls, but instead gravitated toward the forgotten corners, the weaving tools, the old curator's ledger, the faded photographs others passed over. He paused longest at the veil. He tilted his head as he viewed it, not in awe or reverence, but in quiet analysis. Unusual composition, he murmured aloud, though to no one in particular. The texture suggests multiple authors. Miss Marple, who had appeared silently beside him, replied, "It does." He turned. "Oh, I didn't see. Pardon me. Miss Marple. Ah, Miss Marple, you work here." She smiled without warmth. "You might say the museum has known me longer than I've known it." He gave a soft laugh, unsure how to respond. She gestured to the panel. "What do you see?" He took another step closer. 6 figures, but only 5 are finished. "Are they?" His gaze sharpened. "One appears, altered, recently. This one here." He pointed directly to the figure once meant to be hers. The embroidery is slightly misaligned, as if the pattern shifted mid-thread. That's not typical in conserved pieces. May I ask, has this been restored? No, she said. It has only remembered. He chuckled awkwardly. I beg your pardon. Miss Marple did not reply. She turned and walked away, slowly, with the grace of someone who had just heard a thread twitch in the distance. Behind her, Edmund Darrell stared once more at the veil, then leaned in and placed his palm against the glass. Edmund Darrell did not move for several seconds. His hand remained pressed to the glass, fingers splayed like a question, unasked, but already answered. The surface was cool, smooth, as expected, but beneath it, he sensed a tension. Not mechanical, not electrical, organic, like holding your palm over water just before it boils. Something waiting. He pulled back, but not before the veil responded. Miss Marple, now standing at the far end of the hall, did not need to see the glass to know what was happening. She felt it in her spine. A tremor, like a muscle contracting. The veil was choosing again. She turned. Edmund had stepped back. He blinked, disoriented, his pupils slightly dilated, a faint shimmer of sweat on his brow. What is it? He asked softly. I felt, but he didn't finish. Miss Marple approached, slowly, carefully, and looked once more at the panel. A seventh figure had begun, still threadbare, still shapeless, but present. At the hem of its unfinished robe, just 4 letters, barely visible, in ghost grey silk. D-R-E. She met his eyes. You should go, she said, gently. He frowned. I only just arrived. Then go further, she replied, her voice like folded lace. Because the veil knows time, and now it knows you. He gave a half laugh, unsure if he was being teased. But something in her face, something ancient and certain, made him uneasy. He left, not immediately, but soon, and as his footsteps faded down the corridor, Miss Marple stood before the veil, once more. The thread had stopped moving, for now, but the 7th space remained, open, waiting, because the veil does not forget. It never forgets. Chapter 11. A rational mind, Miss Marple did not believe in curses. She had said so aloud once, years ago, at a Women's Garden Society meeting in St. Mary Mead, to the visible discomfort of 2 clergymen's wives and 1 retired medium. A curse, she had said, is often just an echo, given a name by those too frightened to find the source. She still believed that, mostly, and yet the veil had not lied. It had remembered names no one had spoken. It had moved when untouched. It had marked those who deceived and spared those who confessed. It had even tried to mark her. So now, seated at her desk in the museum's south study, curtain drawn, kettle silent, books spread open like wings, Miss Marple turned once more to her greatest strength, reason, and the first anomaly she returned to was not the veil. It was the clock. The grandfather clock, outside the central exhibit, had ticked reliably for 87 years, until last night. At 2:41 a.m., it had stopped, and then begun again. But not forward, backward. Only for 1 minute. Just long enough to erase a name from the visitor's log. Edmund Darrell's. She found it in the carbon paper. There, in faint imprint, Darrell. E. But the actual sheet was blank. The veil had not only recorded him, it had removed him. She took a breath, sat upright, and whispered to the empty room. You're not rewriting time. You're making time rewrite itself. The candle burned low beside her notes, casting a soft golden ring that never quite reached the corners of the study. Miss Marple had spent the last hour categorizing every name that had ever appeared on the veil, at least those she could recall. Finch, Emery, Margot, herself, nearly Henry, now Darrell. Each added, in order of deception, or so it seemed. But when she laid their names side by side, the pattern faltered. Margot had hidden nothing. She had spoken the truth, at least as much of it as she understood, and yet her name appeared before Emery's. Why? Miss Marple picked up her pencil, tapped it against the spine of Eliza Finch's diary, and stared into the dark. Her thoughts no longer tracked in straight lines. The logic she trusted, deductive, procedural, rational, had become a circle, or worse, a spiral. Names were not added in order of guilt. They were added in order of intention. Margot hadn't lied, but she had run. Emery hadn't fled, but he had concealed. Finch had feared. Henry, innocent as he was, had listened when he shouldn't have. And she had known, long ago. She had known what cloth he'd created, had seen the veil's first incomplete stitch, and she had stayed silent. Not out of cruelty, but doubt, and doubt, she realized now, was not the absence of belief. It was belief, unspoken. The veil punished silence more than lies. It had always done so. She looked again at her list, then crossed out every word but one. Silence. At that moment, the candle sputtered, and from the far corner of the study, a thread fell from the ceiling. A single piece of white lace, looped into the shape of a question mark. The museum was silent, as it always was at night. But this silence felt not like rest, nor pause, but waiting. The kind of silence a person hears just before the ground gives way beneath them. Miss Marple lit a second candle and carried it from the study into the upper archive, where only the curators were allowed. She did not knock. The veil had stopped pretending to follow rules. Neither would she. The ledger cabinet stood untouched. But there, behind a false back panel, was a drawer she had not known existed, until now. She slid it open. Inside, a letter, sealed with black wax, addressed not to a name, but a title. To the archivist. When she finally remembers, her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The paper inside was old, not parchment, fabric finely pressed, cotton linen, stitched with red ink in long looping script. She read, "You watched me hang. You recorded the names of men who cursed me, but not my own. You told yourself you were preserving history, but you were preserving a lie. I waited in silence, as you did. I stitched the pain you would not speak. Now, the pattern must end. Not with silence, with truth. Speak me whole. No signature, no threat, just that one directive. Speak me whole." She folded the fabric, returned to the hall, to the veil. It was late, but the veil was awake. It no longer glimmered, it breathed, and now, it showed something new. A memory, not stitched. Projected, as if the thread had pulled time into view. She saw herself, not as she was, but as she had been. Young, unsure, seated at the loom with a needle in her hand, and her supervisor's voice in her ear. "Leave the name out. It won't change the truth. It will only make it louder." And she had obeyed. She had preserved history. She had betrayed memory. She stepped closer to the veil, now, and whispered, not a confession, but a correction. Cloth-filled Veline. The veil pulsed. A shimmer ran through its edges, like wind, through a field of wheat. But it did not erase her. It did not release her, because the betrayal had not been the name. The betrayal was the choice. And now, the pattern required another. Chapter 12. The final stitch. Miss Marple rose before dawn. No tea, no gloves, no mirror. She dressed plainly and walked through Little Davington as though following a funeral procession no one else could see. The village was still asleep. though one might be forgiven for thinking it had ceased to exist. Even the birds had gone quiet. The sky was neither dark nor light, just the color of hesitation. At the museum steps, she paused. The front doors were already open. The veil had been waiting. Inside, the lamps lit themselves as she passed. The corridors did not creak. The fabric inside the cases did not flutter. Everything had settled into stillness, and it was not peace. It was purpose. The central exhibit hall welcomed her like a cathedral welcomes the penitent. The veil was not just hanging. It was radiant. It shimmered with the memory of all it had recorded. 7 figures now. One still incomplete. Hers. It would not finish itself. Not unless she chose. Miss Marple stepped forward, thread in one hand, needle in the other. She had brought no spool, only the red thread she had kept hidden for years, the one sealed in the conservator's drawer, marked reserved for correction. She touched the veil, and for the first time, it touched back. Not physically, not forcefully, but through recognition. She whispered, "I will not let history silence memory again," and began to stitch. Not her own name, not Henry's, not Emery's, not Mago's, Clothel Veilin. Again and again. A circle of her name, repeated in thread, surrounding the 7 figures. Miss Marple's hands moved with quiet grace, and as the final stitch pulled through the linen, the veil stopped, not faded, not fell. It simply became complete. There are moments in a lifetime when the past does not feel like a trail receding behind us, but rather a loop tightening around our ankles, quietly, efficiently, almost politely. And Miss Marple, as she stood in the breathless half-light of the central exhibit hall, with the veil before her, and the weight of untold names stitched into its fabric, understood at last that what she was being asked to do was not simply the final act of a historian, nor even the contrition of a woman burdened by long-forgotten guilt, but something far more ancient and intimate, an offering, a surrender not of body, nor even soul, but of narrative, of presence, of the ability to control how one is remembered, or whether one is remembered at all. For the veil, now humming gently beneath her fingertips, as though the threads themselves pulsed with heartbeats that did not belong to the living, was not content with confession or completion. It demanded balance, symmetry, restoration of a pattern disrupted not by violence, but by omission, by the silence of those who saw and chose not to speak, who knew and chose not to record, who lived and chose not to finish the threads they had begun. She moved not with the hesitancy of fear, but with the certainty of someone who had at last deciphered the full geometry of her part in the story. Each stitch she had made earlier, the looping inscription of Clothel's name, again and again, in a circular band around the 7 figures, had not weakened the veil, as she had hoped, nor severed its power, but instead completed something old and sacred, and terrifyingly precise. For the veil was never the curse itself, merely its memory, and memory, once acknowledged, becomes legacy, and legacies, once made complete, become obligations, inheritances passed, not by blood, but by awareness. And so, as she stood facing the now complete panel, the red thread tucked away in her palm, and the faint ache of long sewing in her wrists, she felt the room shift, not in temperature, nor gravity, but in context. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to lean inward slightly, as though the entire museum, long dormant, had turned its face toward her, and was now listening, waiting, weighing, as if it too had been part of the pattern all along, and had simply been quiet until it was safe to speak again. The veil no longer shimmered, it breathed, softly, rhythmically, a rise and fall, so subtle, it might have been imagined, were it not for the faint movement of dust along its hem, And it was in that moment, just before she turned to leave, that she understood the cost not of failure, but of completion. For something had been bound here. Yes, some old wrong had been named, the final thread drawn tight. But something else had been exchanged. Some ledger of truth, balanced not with life, but with memory. And she, Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead, detective of subtle crimes and silent motives, archivist interim, of a truth too long left unfinished, now felt a soft untethering, in her own mind, not painful, not harsh, but gentle, like lace coming loose from the edge of a sleeve. She would leave the museum whole, yes, but lighter, emptier, as if the veil had taken back the piece of her it had once remembered, and now no longer required, a cost paid not in blood, but in clarity. Outside, the village had begun to stir, unaware that anything inside the museum had changed, unaware that a needle, long silent, had sung its final note, or that a piece of history had quietly folded itself closed behind a curtain of thread. There were no cries, no shattering of glass, no ominous tolling of bells, to mark the end of the veil's vigil, only a soft hush, as though the building itself had taken a long slow breath, and exhaled it into stillness. Miss Marple remained alone in the hall, the light from the eastern windows washing across the floor in quiet bands of silver, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt no movement, no resistance, not even a whisper behind the fabric. The veil had stilled, not vanished, not faded, but entered a kind of sleep, the way one closes a book, not to discard it, but to protect the pages, until the story must be read again. And yet, even in its slumber, she sensed that it was not gone, merely satisfied. The thread had been given its due, the pattern completed with the precision and finality only truth could bring. It had not demanded blood, as so many assumed such legends must. It had demanded memory, and now that memory had been restored, honestly, fully, it no longer needed to act. The danger had never been the veil's existence. The danger had always been the silence around it, the fear of naming what had been stitched into it by those whose stories had been erased, or softened, or displaced. Now, those names were whole, not loud, not angry, just present. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, absorbing the quiet not as victory, but as grace. She understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone else could, that the veil was not just an object of horror or history. It was a ledger, a kind of living conscience for a place that had been built on lace, yes, but also on loss. The museum had survived for centuries, not because it was preserved by curators or funded by benefactors, but because something within it had remembered what others had tried to forget. And now, with the pattern sealed, the memory closed, it would sleep until awakened again by omission, or cowardice, or another name left unspoken. She turned away at last, her footsteps unhurried, deliberate. Henry would ask her what had happened. Emery would perhaps never understand what he had seen. The villagers would eventually forget the odd events of that damp week, but the veil would not forget, and neither, she hoped, would she, though already there were pieces of it drifting from her thoughts like fog leaving morning fields, memories softening at the edges, facts sliding from sequence into something less rigid, less painful. The cost was being paid in real time, and it was a bargain she had made with eyes wide open. And so she left the museum quietly, just as she had arrived, slipping through the doors as they eased shut behind her, and stepped out into the morning with the certainty that for now, the veil would not call another name, not because the danger had ended, but because, at least once in its long and silent life, the truth had been spoken aloud. Chapter 13. The Echo Pattern. There are endings that do not settle but echo, like a bell rung once and then left to resonate through stone, wood, and bone, long after the hand that struck it has moved on. Though the veil now hung dormant in its panelled frame, its surface smooth and thread still. Something in the museum had not returned to rest. The air remained thick, with the sense of a presence, not active, but aware, not pursuing, but remembering. And those who passed through the corridors, visitors, staff, porters on their lunch rounds, felt it in the way one feels watched in an empty room. Even without motion, the veil remained a presence that asked one question, gently but persistently: what have you left unsaid? In the week following Miss Marple's final act of completion, small details began to shift in the village, not grand, not theatrical, but deliberate. The plaque beside the statue of Mayor Corwin, long admired for his patronage of the lace industry, now bore a faint outline of a second name beneath it. Daryl, once removed by city officials during a scandal, and it seemed, quietly returned by time. In the baker's window, a lace curtain appeared that no one remembered hanging, and yet each morning it displayed a new motif. One day a spindle, the next a pair of scissors, and on Friday a tear-shaped bobbin with 7 loops woven tightly across its length. And at the church, Father Bertram paused mid-sermon when he noticed a figure in the third pew wearing a mourning veil, black, delicate, finely stitched, and when he blinked, it was gone. Only a thread remained on the pew, a single loop, still warm. Miss Marple watched these events from the distance of discretion. She no longer lingered in the museum, nor kept to her notebooks. She walked the village slowly, eyes not searching, but listening, watching not for people, but for patterns. She had expected the veil's influence to end with her act of naming, but she now saw that such hope had been naive. The veil had slept, yes, but like all things created to carry memory, it echoed. It called not loudly, but gently, into the empty places where truth had once lived. It would not claim another name. Not yet, but it would whisper to those who forgot. It would remind, and it would wait. The museum had begun its slow preparations for the spring retrospective, a minor event in Little Davington's social calendar, but one which demanded the same quiet precision as any grand London gala, at least to those who lived in the folds of its lace-lined culture. Miss Marple did not involve herself this time. She declined the advisory post, stepped back from board meetings, and offered no protest when her name was replaced with a younger, newer one on the exhibit schedule. Clara Levitt, 27, studious, cautious, and in her own words, very lucky to be offered such a historical placement. The staff, for the most part, welcomed her politely, though with the quiet weariness of those who had seen replacements come and go without ceremony. It was Miss Marple who took the most interest in her, not overtly, not as a mentor, but as one might observe a player entering a game whose rules had not been explained. Clara did not strike one as superstitious. She was the product of modern training, conservation science, restoration ethics, digital archiving, yet within her precise methods lived an almost unconscious reverence for the objects she handled. She wore gloves religiously. She whispered names aloud when labeling boxes. She apologized when folders tore. And most telling of all, she never once entered the central exhibit hall alone. Not after the first week. Not after she made a discovery, which she did not speak of, but which left her pale and unusually silent the next morning in the records room. It had happened late. The staff had gone. Clara, finishing an inventory of the preserved veil cases, had paused to examine the base of the panel, where an old nailhead had caught her sleeve. She tugged gently, expecting it to be nothing more than rust, but beneath it, tucked carefully behind the lower hem of the linen, she found a note, pressed between layers of glass and thread, yellowed with age, but clearly not part of the original artifact. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink had bled, but she made out the final line. When they forget, it begins again. She returned the note where she found it, resealed the panel, and said nothing to the others. But the next morning, she reorganized the entire archive, alphabetically, by first names. Miss Marple noticed, and said nothing. Clara had not yet been chosen, but the veil had taken an interest, and if the pattern held true, she would not be asked to serve. She would be remembered. The archive smelled faintly of linen and dust, a scent not unpleasant, but heavy with the weight of untouched time, as though every folder, every stitched tag and faded envelope, carried the exhaled breath of the one who last dared to disturb it. Clara Levitt, meticulous by nature, untrained by discipline, found comfort in order, but even the most rational mind cannot help but sense when the familiar begins to bend subtly out of shape, and it was during one of her late afternoon cataloguing sessions, sunlight slanting across her papers, like gold thread across parchment, that she noticed something that hadn't been there before, a single piece of lace, folded into the corner of her notes, identical in thread, and cut to the veil, in the central exhibit, though she had never removed any part of the display, nor had she entered the gallery that day. The lace bore no label, no accession number, no curator's tag, only a small embroidered letter in red, barely visible, unless turned toward the light. She paused. Not afraid, not yet, but aware of something nudging at the edges of her precision. She placed the lace into a specimen envelope, not out of fear of contamination, but in accordance with museum standards. Everything must be documented, even anomalies. And as she sealed it, the overhead lights flickered once, not enough to darken the room, but enough to shift the shadows on the floor in such a way that she thought, for just a moment, someone had passed behind her. She turned. No one. Only the rows of cabinets, their brass handles winking in the last of the light. She laughed softly to herself. Too much coffee, she whispered. But even as she said it, her fingers strayed toward her notebook, and she scribbled down the letter, ink circled. No date, no context. Upstairs, the veil remained still. No new names, no movement. But in its threads, in the delicate tension between memory and forgetting, a single line began to pull loose from the hem, not rapidly, not violently, but gently, as if curious. Not for revenge, not for justice, but for recognition, because a pattern, once completed, does not vanish. It waits. And in waiting, it listens. And in listening, it begins again. Chapter 14. Miss Marple reflects. The morning unfolded, not with ceremony, but with a kind of knowing stillness, as if the earth itself had chosen to pause. In the garden behind her modest cottage in Little Davington, Miss Marple sat alone beneath the shaded lattice of the pergola, where vines of wisteria, not yet in full bloom, curled like unfinished questions over the beam above her head. The spring air, cool but no longer biting, carried the scent of overturned soil, early blossom, and the faintest touch of coal smoke drifting lazily from a nearby chimney. There was no wind, yet the chimes hung from the porch eaves, tapped faintly against one another, as though nudged, not by breeze, but by memory. She did not notice them at first. Her thoughts had already pulled away from the morning, away from the garden, and the quiet joy of tending the rose trellises, and setting the bird feeders, and into something older, heavier, more abstract, yet more urgent, with each passing moment. She had spent her life solving puzzles, murders, thefts, deceptions of all kinds, all tidily wound within the confines of human motive. But the events at the Lace Museum had not followed the usual course. What had unfolded there could not be mapped along lines of jealousy, greed, revenge, or even madness. The veil, its quiet power, its response to memory, to silence, to confession. It had not accused, it had remembered. And now that it had, it no longer needed to speak. But what if remembering was not enough? She sipped her tea, lukewarm now, and stared at the crocuses rising in the corner bed. Her fingers, lightly gloved against the morning chill, rested on the teacup's handle with the practiced elegance of someone who had learned long ago that the world noticed the tiniest slips in posture when one grew old. She wondered, not aloud, but inwardly, as one might breathe a thought too fragile to voice, whether what they had all encountered was something truly external, or if it was simply the most intricate pattern of all, the repetition of wrongs, unspoken, stitched again and again, through generations, until the thread itself had become sentient by force of memory alone. Not a ghost, not a curse, a record, a pattern so repeated, so sacred in its betrayal, that to break it would be to unmake the structure of those who had built their lives upon forgetting. Her gaze turned skyward, where a single bird traced a lazy arc across the blue. She remembered something Clothild had said, or perhaps something she had imagined. Clothild might have said, had the girl lived to tell her own story. It is not that we fear evil, it is that we fear we would recognize ourselves in it. And that thought stayed with her as a sound approached, not from within, but from the garden gate, light and deliberate, the sound of shoes upon gravel, the purposeful rhythm of someone with a task, but no urgency, someone delivering, not visiting. She did not rise at once when she heard the sound, no rush of alarm, no instinctive startle, but simply tilted her head slightly, listening, weighing the texture of the moment. It was not unexpected, though nothing had been arranged. The rhythm of the steps was too light to belong to the postman, too purposeful to belong to a neighbor's child, fetching a stray cat, or returning a wayward newspaper. And so when she finally stood, careful and unhurried, she found exactly what she had already imagined would be waiting for her on the weathered oak table by the garden gate. A package, small, square, wrapped with crisp brown paper and tied with a double knot of twine, precise, economical, and utterly devoid of sentiment. There was no note, no return address, no handwriting, only the weight of it in her palm, which told her more than she had any right to know. She held it for a moment, not bringing it inside, but letting the warmth of the sun touch its edges, as though to coax from it some sense of its intent. It was not malevolent, no, nothing about it screamed or warned, but there was that stillness again, the kind that settled when something long buried rose to the surface, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. Miss Marple brought the parcel to the garden bench, sat with it on her lap, and opened it slowly, not with dread, but with ceremony. The paper peeled back with a soft resistance, like the page of an old book reluctant to reveal a painful chapter. Inside was a velvet box, black, worn at the edges, yet unmistakably crafted to cradle something delicate, something sharp. She lifted the lid. Lace scissors, small, curved, beautifully forged, the kind used not for cutting crude fabric, but for the precise, reverent trimming of patterns so fine they whispered against the fingertip. But it was the color that caught her breath, though her face betrayed nothing. The blades, silver dulled by age, bore a faint maroon stain near the hinge, dried, old, yet not time-worn enough to be dismissed as rust. She knew better. These were the scissors, not a replica, not a copy, not the ceremonial pair she had seen briefly documented in a hidden footnote of the museum's early inventories. These were real, returned, and as she turned them over in her hands, a chill passed not across her skin, but through her memory, as if some distant moment, forgotten, half imagined, had brushed against the back of her mind and whispered, "This was never finished." She set the scissors down gently beside her on the bench, eyes never leaving them, and listened, not for sound, but for intention. The garden remained quiet. The chimes had ceased. Even the birds had paused, not because they sensed danger, but because they too were waiting. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew, not from logic, but from the deep, delicate instinct honed over a lifetime, spent listening to the spaces between words, that the pattern had not been fully severed. The veil may have been completed, but something had chosen not to rest. Not yet. The scissors remained beside her, mute but heavy, as though they carried not just metal but memory, sharpened not by grindstone, but by repetition, by the sheer insistence of forgotten acts. Miss Marple did not touch them again, not immediately. She simply looked, and in that gaze there was no fear, but something more unsettling, recognition. These were not merely tools of craftsmanship. They were evidence, not of a crime, but of a truth long trimmed and hemmed and folded out of history, until only its outline remained, like lace pressed between panes of glass, admired for its elegance, and not its origin. She sat back slowly, the wood of the bench creaking under her weight, though not in protest, more like acknowledgement. Her eyes drifted to the flower beds, where the wind, absent until now, stirred the taller stems of foxglove and lavender, not wildly, but precisely, like fingers moving through fabric, testing the weave. She had a sudden sense, not of being watched, but of being measured, not judged, just counted. As if the tally of those who had remembered too late was being revised. There had been a time, long ago, when she believed justice to be the balancing of wrong against consequence, the neat accounting of human misdeeds. But what she had learned in that silent museum, beneath the gaze of a veil that stitched its truths into linen rather than confessionals, was that justice, real justice, did not punish. It preserved. It remembered. It waited, and something, someone, was waiting now. She glanced again at the scissors. They had been sent to her, not to threaten, not to accuse, but to ask, to choose. Because that was what this had always been about, not guilt, not vengeance, but choice. The veil had never forced. It had responded. Each name stitched, each thread pulled, each figure embroidered into its terrible memory had come not from cruelty, but from complicity. Not silence alone, but the decision to leave things unsaid, undone, uncut. The blades glinted now, as the sun reached the corner of the bench. Red shimmered faintly in the groove along the hinge. She closed the box, not as refusal, as recognition. The pattern would not continue itself. But it had not ended. Not yet. The garden's quiet returned. The chimes began to ring softly once more. The birds resumed their distant chorus. But behind that curtain of ordinary morning, something darker was stirring, gently, deliberately, because there was one thread left uncut, and one truth left unspoken, and the silence. Chapter 15. The final pattern. The morning was not loud, but it arrived with intention. A faint dampness clung to the garden soil, and the light filtering through Miss Marple's window was that particular shade of grey-blue that suggests clarity rather than cold. She rose before the village did, dressed not out of routine, but out of quiet resolve, and for the first time in nearly a week did not linger at the kettle or peer into her rose beds or count the chimes on the mantel clock. Instead, she moved with the slow but deliberate grace of one who is not racing against time, but meeting it face to face. The scissors, those lace-cutting blades, delivered without sender or explanation, remained unopened on her writing desk, though she had turned the box 3 times the night before, once in the dark, once by candlelight, and once after midnight, each time half hoping the velvet would feel different, lighter perhaps, as if the weight of memory had lifted from the hinges. But it had not, nor had it grown heavier. It simply waited, as all old truths do, until they are either remembered or erased. She took them now, not as a weapon, nor as a key, but as a reply, and she walked through the village, through its cobbled turnings and weathered hedgerows, past shops still shuttered, and bicycles leaned gently against stoops like animals resting. She moved like a memory, acknowledged, familiar, but not yet understood. The museum's front doors, as always, met her not with resistance, but with an eerie kind of welcome. They opened before she reached them, the lock not clicked open by a staff hand or unseen custodian, but perhaps by memory itself. Inside, the air was unchanged, cool, dry, dense with the scent of linen dust and preserved things. The central exhibit hall lay quiet, the veil suspended in its glass panel, unmoving, unshimmering, but not forgotten. She passed it without touching it. It had shown her all it could, and now something else waited. The clue had not come to her in a flash, but rather, like all her best realizations, it had arrived slowly, woven between pauses, murmurs, inconsistencies. The museum floor plans, ones she had studied months earlier during the gala's preparations, listed 34 rooms. She had counted only 33, the one that did not appear on the tour, the one without a name, not a mistake, a removal. She crossed the exhibit floor now, stepping lightly, but not quickly, eyes scanning the walls, her fingers brushing the embroidered frame of an outdated fire map in the south hallway, and there beneath it, set into the plaster, she found it, a seam, not of wallboard, not of wood, but of fabric, painted to look like masonry, but upon close inspection, fraying just slightly at the edges. She leaned close, the scissors now in her palm, and then, without ceremony, she snipped, once, a sharp, decisive sound, thread through air, and the wall peeled, not fell, not burst open. It simply parted, like drapery long forgotten, revealing a narrow staircase, descending not into shadow, but into stillness. And so she went down, not quickly, not with fear, with understanding, because something waited below, and it remembered her. The stairs were narrow, not by design, but by discretion, as though they had been intended not for hiding, but for forgetting, built downward not into storage, nor cellars, nor even secrecy, but into something more unsettling, a chamber beneath memory, hollowed out not by time or tools, but by the weight of things left unsaid. The stone underfoot was older than the museum's registered foundation, worn smooth, not from generations of footsteps, but from the absence of them, as though the floor itself had grown tired of waiting. Miss Marple descended slowly, hand grazing the cold wall for balance, not from weakness, but to feel the space breathe around her. The light grew dim, but never vanished. It emanated not from any electric fixture, nor from the faint crack in the museum above, but from the lace itself. At the bottom of the steps, the air was dry and oddly warm, insulated, perhaps by the very layers of fabric that lined the room. And what a room it was, oval in shape, walls curved like the inside of a spool, and every surface, ceiling, floor, and even door seams, lined in lace, not hung, not draped, woven directly into the walls, as though the building had grown it like a skin. Each panel was distinct, some large, some barely the size of a handkerchief, all embroidered, but not with florals or motifs. These bore faces, human faces, stitched in impossible detail, each eye shaded with such realism, one could not tell if the threads had faded, or if the faces themselves had looked away. There were dozens, possibly hundreds, some she knew, some she remembered from village records, some she had only seen in sketches, in obituaries, in faded negatives, labeled unidentified female, circa 1810. But they were here, every one of them, and in the center of the room, a pedestal, bare, except for one thing, a folded cloth, newly placed, still bearing the tension of fresh embroidery. Miss Marple stepped forward. She did not need to unfold it. She already knew it was hers, not from childhood, not in youth. Her now, her hands, her profile, her eyes, threaded in red, perfect, precise. She did not gasp, she did not flinch, but her breath caught, just for a moment, as one might react upon finding a portrait of themselves in a house they've never visited, painted by a hand they never met, in a style no longer taught, and yet unmistakably present, as if it had always been there, simply waiting to be found. The likeness was exact, not romanticized, not softened, but rendered with that brutal, elegant precision only truth can achieve. It captured her not in fear, nor in triumph, but in stillness, a calm held between knowing and decision. The lips closed, the hands folded, the eyes not pleading, not resigned, just aware. Miss Marple stood alone in the lace-walled room, the pattern of history now quite literally surrounding her, and it was there, in that place below the memory of little Davington, that she understood the final truth. The veil had never been a single item, a relic contained within the confines of one exhibit, or even one museum. The veil had only ever been the beginning, a visible thread meant to lure the attentive, to invite the quiet-minded, the curious, the thoughtful, those who listened more than they spoke, and watched the corners of things rather than the center. The veil was not a trap, not an artifact of vengeance. It was a map, a guide, a first stitch. What it led to was this room, this archive, this gallery of the forgotten stitched not in blood, but in silence, and all who had held the veil, those few throughout history, granted even brief custodianship, had in time contributed to it, willingly or not, consciously or not, by denying a truth, by naming one aloud, by returning what was once stolen, or refusing to acknowledge what had been erased. They gave the veil its next name, its next face, its next pattern. It had not punished them, it had remembered them, and now, it remembered her. There was no sound in the room, no clock, no air vent, no distant creak of wood above. Even her own heartbeat seemed to move in silence now, like an old metronome, just out of time. The lace shimmered faintly on the walls, not movement, not breath, but something else, anticipation. She looked down at the panel with her face folded, not yet hung, not yet placed. She reached forward and touched the edge, not to reject it, not to accept it, but to feel the thread, the texture, the weight of what it meant to be remembered truthfully, not through legacy or reputation, but through action. One last stitch remained unpulled, and it would be hers to make. The room offered no advice, only space, only time, and just before she turned, just before she stepped away from the pedestal, her hand brushed something tucked beneath the folded panel, a card, brittle, half-tucked beneath a seam. It bore no signature, only a phrase. When they forget, it begins again. She placed it gently back beneath the fold, and as she ascended the stairs, stepping slowly back toward the light of the waking museum, she understood that the pattern did not require her end, only her memory. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, not hatred, not revenge, something far more ordinary, repetition, because forgetting is never passive, it is chosen, and patterns, they return, unless someone cuts the thread. The end. And now, dear viewer, if you have traveled this entire journey with us, from Miss Marple's first step into the museum, to the final fold of her likeness into history, then you too have seen the pattern for what it is. If you believe these stories must be remembered, if you see the truth behind the veil, then take a moment to do what so few dare. Like this video, share it with someone who sees the world sideways, as Miss Marple always did, and most importantly, subscribe, so the thread is never lost again. Thank you for watching.